Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. Let's talk about Russian attrition. Now, attrition is an important topic, one that we used to talk about a lot, but that has now been largely forgotten, even by people like myself. A lot of excitement has happened in the war in Ukraine lately. In particular, Ukraine walked over into Russian territory and captured a huge chunk of the Kursk region from Russia. And since then, Russia has been progressively taking pieces of that territory back, albeit at a huge cost. And in this excitement, a lot of people are teeter-tottering between emotions, feeling a sense of jubilance seeing Ukraine capture Russian territory to a feeling of dread seeing Ukraine get slowly and progressively pushed back. And amidst all these emotions, one of the things that a lot of us have forgotten is that at its core, this war is not about who takes this piece of territory at this time, but rather who can execute the largest cost on their opponents. Fundamentally, the war in Ukraine at its core is a war of attrition. And so I wanted to spend this video analyzing how that's going right now. This is a good week to talk about this, because if you have been paying attention to the numbers, for the past 2 weeks, Russia has progressively, each week, managed to have its highest casualty week of the war, back to back. In other words, Russia is taking a lot of punishment right now. They are taking a lot of losses, and they are taking a lot of risks, and they are doing that for a particular reason. The reason Russia is losing so much right now is because they are on the offensive. And most likely they are on the offensive because the US presidential election is next week. Now, historically throughout this war, we have seen Russia take its biggest risks of human losses leading up to political events. For example, leading up to the Russian presidential election, Russia was conducting its assault on Avdiivka, which was a horrendous battle where Russia was taking tons and tons of casualties, and Ukraine was taking comparatively little, but where basically Russia wanted to show progress on the battlefield, on the maps specifically, leading up to the election, so that Putin could frame the war as if it were going well, and as if it were a victory, or could end in victory. And so right now Russia has been doing the same thing and has been on the offensive for several months because it wants to convince a different political audience that Russia is doing well in its war. In this case, probably the Americans and a lot of Europeans who Russia wants to convince that Ukraine is unable to win the war, and so they should stop their support of Ukraine in order to hopefully stop the bloodshed. Now, this can be a little bit frustrating, but I want to frame this basically as a gamble on Putin's part and on the part of the Russian generals. They are gambling that higher attritional losses in the short term will be worthwhile if it produces a political outcome that causes Russia to suffer less losses in the long term. This then is a theme that we are actually seeing of most of Russia's wartime strategy right now, and I want to extrapolate from that, from the front lines today, to Russia's wartime strategy as a whole, to show why Russia's current rate of losses is unsustainable and will cause Russia to lose the war, but only if the war continues long enough for that to happen. To start that deeper examination, it's important that I first lay a baseline that I've also explained in other videos, which is that the war in Ukraine will be won not by the side that gets the catastrophic breakthroughs on the battlefield today, but by the side that can expose their enemy to the most losses today so that they can tomorrow get catastrophic breakthroughs when the other side has been worn down and can't support their front line anymore. We know this is the case because for almost 2 years now, Ukraine has been locked into basically the same front line with Russia, with very little movement on the battlefield besides that Kursk region that I mentioned earlier. And basically this is similar to what happened in World War I, where both sides were locked in trench warfare until the industry of one side wore down, and eventually they couldn't support their front line anymore. Once they couldn't support their front line anymore, the other side got catastrophic breakthroughs and within a couple of months, the entire war effort failed. Most likely, that is the end game that we are looking for in Ukraine. We are probably not looking for an end to the war within the next couple months, maybe not even within the next year. We are looking for the war to be won by the side that can outlast the other one long enough to have enough forces to push through their front line when the other side is too weak to continue fighting back. Now, that being said, that is very bad news for Russia, because Russia is reaching a point in attrition where their industry can no longer keep up. When Russia started this war, they had a couple of advantages that made up for their very, very poor strategic moves. The first advantage was that they had a big savings account to draw from. About $650 billion, half of which was frozen by the West. And so Russia could basically draw against half of that, about $325 billion, to fund its war. Russia also had something else. Russia had vast stockpiles of Soviet-era gear that they could take from junkyards, refurbish, and send to the front line. Not the best thing for the Russian soldiers that have to operate that equipment, but good enough that it could allow Russia to continue fighting the war and feed its losses for the short term. Both of those things are now starting to break down. I've already done an entire separate video showing and demonstrating how Russia's deep savings account is basically evaporated, causing massive inflation in the Russian economy as Russia tries to print money because they can't draw from their savings anymore. And generally speaking, we are seeing a lot less Russian equipment on the battlefield. And this is being shown in the way that Russians are now resorting to using things like golf carts, tricked out golf carts, but golf carts nonetheless that are open and don't require nearly as much metal or steel or other parts to produce. And also using things like motorcycles to transport men to the front lines instead of APCs, armored personnel carriers, even Soviet-era armored personnel carriers. In fact, to back that up, a lot of satellites, since it was discovered that Russia was pulling Soviet-era gear out of stocks, have been monitoring those stocks. And it is now becoming increasingly clear from satellite photography that Russia's Soviet-era stocks are running low. So Russia is running low on all of the important things to back up their war against Ukraine from an industry standpoint and from an economic standpoint. And this is really catastrophic for Russia, because the war in Ukraine, while it does require manpower, is primarily a war of attrition from the standpoint of equipment and industry, just like even World War I was. Both countries, Ukraine and Russia, could theoretically do morbid things to put more bodies on the battlefield. They could do very unpopular things like conscription. They may not want to do things, but they theoretically could. But when it comes to equipment, when you run out, there is no easy way to magically get more equipment on the battlefield at the same time. So that's becoming a major problem for Russia, and it's finally getting to the point where there are holes that they can't patch anymore. Now, Russia obviously knows this, and they are not just sitting idly by and doing nothing. So for the past several months, Russia has been increasingly transitioning to a full wartime economy, similar to how in World War II, Hitler transitioned Germany to a full wartime economy when he was getting further and further on the back foot. The idea is, if we can't put more men on the front lines, we can at least put more men behind industry, because that is a more popular alternative to sending people to their deaths. And so Russia has been trying to do that, and even as such, we are still finding that they are running out of equipment. This is a big problem, because the thing about a wartime economy is that it is fundamentally unsustainable. The reason you have a wartime economy is because you are hoping to produce a victory quickly so that you can then go back to a regular economy more quickly. But if you go and transition into a wartime economy and the victory does not come quickly, What it does is it actually forces the attrition to catch up to you quicker. It causes the results of the war to trickle through your society quicker. And that is probably what we're going to see happen to Russia the longer that this continues. Now, of course, devil's advocate, Ukraine is obviously experiencing the same thing. But there's some interesting things that are going on with Ukraine that are different from Russia. Both Ukraine and Russia have shortages in certain categories of equipment. But Russia does not have any surpluses that they're able to export to other countries. Ukraine is the opposite. Ukraine, in their wartime economy, is producing surpluses of things like drones that they are now in very heavy discussions and have had internal agreements to begin exporting to other countries. So in the most important categories, Russia is failing to provide sufficient equipment to the front line, while Ukraine has a surplus that they can export. So that tells you something right on the head. But there's another factor for Ukraine. I already mentioned how a wartime economy is fundamentally unsustainable. But Ukraine has a lot of partners that are not in wartime economies. And if these partners continue supporting Ukraine, they are doing so from a standpoint of stability. Which means that as long as Ukraine continues to receive external support, they can outlast Russia from an attritional standpoint here. So that's, of course, very worrying for Russia. Speaking of sustainability, I am getting cold and the sun is coming down, so I need to finish this video. But the point is, from an attritional standpoint, Russia is currently losing the war. And I think that is why Russia is so desperately pushing for victory conditions and is becoming more and more open to negotiation. Russia is trying their hardest to use everything they have right now all at once because Russia knows that they can't sustain things over the long term. So they are trying to switch away from a long-term sustainable strategy as sort of a Hail Mary to try to get the victory they need more quickly. If Ukraine can outlast Russia through those pushes, and so far they are, it is going to be very interesting to see if Russia can continue fighting much longer than about a year after this. That's my thoughts for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I have another similar video with some different details that I just posted yesterday, so be sure to check that one out too.